Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste, hello everyone. Welcome to the NPTEL course Role of Craft and Technology in Interior Architecture. Today we are going to discuss module 30, which is the summary of few previous modules, and we'll just try to sum up what we understood about the craft sector in India. So we'll be just summing up the craft sector in terms of the overview, the issues and challenges that it faces, the policies and reforms that have been introduced, what are the gaps that have been identified, and of course the list of references towards the end. To begin with, we tried to understand how is craft sector defined and what is the overview of it specifically in the context of India. So we understood that this sector may be best defined as pertaining to items made either totally or partially by hand, significant for their utility and or decorative value. And we also try to understand that the operational domain of the craft includes statutory bodies, ministries, state departments, boards and autonomous institutions pertaining to handicrafts and handlooms as its core, while drawing upon programs and schemes of rural development, skills development, MSME, tourism, culture, commerce, labor and industry. It also includes NGOs, social enterprises and market organizations and has vertical and horizontal linkages. So it's a gamut of things, and there is a huge umbrella under which lot of these activities are organized and termed together. So craft sector is very humongous, it involves lot of people involved in it, and therefore it's sometimes very challenging to understand it and to come up with policies which could work in its favor, and there are a lot of problems and challenges that come into picture, but I think the government is really working quite elaborately in the direction to overcome the gaps and challenges and to make very relevant policies. Now, despite its rich heritage of traditional manufacturing skills, we learnt that India's share in the international market for craft is under 2%. While that of China stands at 30%. So we saw that despite being a potential sector and despite being, also contributing to the employment in the country, our international, positioning and the share is quite less, which can be really increased. According to the United Nations, over the past 30 years, the number of Indian artisans has decreased by 30%. And we learnt about this alarming number while we were talking about it in the previous lecture, indicating the need to reinvest in artisans to safeguard history, culture and important source of livelihood. So while we are talking about the overview of the sector, we also get figures like this, and they are quite alarming and disturbing, but most definitely now things are improving. We also discussed a little bit about the performing art industry and what are the opportunities that we see, and we discussed how increasing national and international exposure across theatre, dance and crafts industries, upgradation of new technology and settings, rising global demand and emergence of varied performances being experimented as sources for performance are providing opportunities for the industry to capitalize on. So we try to understand the craft sector in terms of the opportunities which are there, in terms of the different kinds of activities that fall under it. And we saw some statistical data, we saw the graphs that explained us, some data regarding the potential of these industries and the revenue generation and how there has been an annual growth rate when we talk about the revenues being generated. So since we are talking about the performing arts industry, and here from 2012 to 2018 we saw this steady growth, and how the revenue forecast was made, and there was this stable growth that was seen. We also saw that the performing arts support activities are also a gamut of activities when we talk about this industry, and there also we see a very steady growth and quite impressive growth actually from here to here. So we saw these kinds of graphs and data to also understand that yes, the number of artisans is decreasing and there is an alarming data that we come across, but then there are also improvements which are happening, and at least that the direction and the vision that the government has or the individuals and the associated organizations have, that's not in a not minuscule, and it's really contributing. Some more data we saw where we saw the export of Indian handicrafts, and we saw this trend rising from 2009-10 to a very huge number here in 2015-16. So we saw these kinds of data sets also. And another data and the table that explains the export figure of handicrafts, and here from 2015-16 to 2016-17 we again saw the rise, and in terms of percentage it's not bad, 18.28%. So again these are all hopes that we have, and the results that we see which make everyone going and encourages and empowers the stakeholders involved in this sector to keep working and to think about a lot of good changes that are going to happen. Of course, having said that, there are a lot of gaps and problems, but yeah, they have to be addressed, and a lot of work is already happening. So because I was talking about the issues and challenges and gaps, so now let's see the issues and challenges which we discussed in great detail, and here we'll just be browsing through them and just see the overview of it. So we saw this slide couple of times, and it very interestingly, elaborately consolidates the key issues and challenges, and we try to understand that. So we talked about the inadequate infrastructure, we talk about the lack of scholarships, sponsorships, lack of awareness towards the government policies, and we talked about lot of onerous regulations, this sometimes services tax that get introduced, and we also talked about the challenges from the current market demand, competition from the industries, multinational corporates, and the mass production of finished groups vis-a-vis the production by hand. We saw all these challenges and issues. Then there were also issues related to permissions, also procuring of the raw material, and then availability of credit, getting loans from the bank, that was also one key issue and a challenge. Then some benefits for artists and employees in terms of pensions and insurance, if that could be introduced, that would give them some security, and already some schemes are there, they need to be strengthened. And rising cost of the raw material, again challenges in the movement of artists, how do we go to them rather taking them out of their community and cluster. So all these issues and challenges we have been discussing about. And we also talked about how apart from vision and political will to develop crafts production as a serious economic proposition, there is always issue of finances which is involved. After all, if we talk of building the barely literate and often indebted craftsman into a self-employed producer, entrepreneur, it will need funding structures. So again, lot of issues related to the lack of funding structures. And then the recent thrust on creating self-help groups and microcredit schemes is bringing the organizational and financial components to suit small businesses and the decentralized sector in rural areas, particularly for women. Unfortunately though, the groups are often well organized, they do not have the production or marketing expertise. So again, the lack of production or marketing expertise that we saw in the previous consolidated table also. And we interestingly discussed about the key challenges in the building craft sector, and we discussed the issues and challenges which have been highlighted by DICRC at SEPC University. Talking in terms of strategic thinking, they point out that there is absence of collaborations of various partners within the built heritage sector for the holistic strategic plans related to building crafts. There is lack of maintenance of our existing traditional and vernacular building stock, as well as the contemporary application of building crafts in current built environment. Because we have been talking about the building crafts and the role of craft and technology in interior architecture, it's very important that we also discuss about the challenges and issues specifically within the building crafts. And there is lack of recruitment strategies to attract the craftspeople needed to solve the current skill shortage within heritage sector. Then there is absence of a defined knowledge documentation system and intercompetence among craftspeople, leading to reduction of the loss of knowledge and skills. That's also a key issue and challenge. Taking it further, the building craft discussion, there is also lack of defined knowledge transfer from one generation to another, leading to decrease of resources as well as interest amongst younger craftspeople. That also has been identified. There is shortage of public awareness of the built heritage sector and work opportunities, causing serious problems related to sustainability and survival amongst the craft persons. The percentage of short-term assignments in the building sector, that also we discussed, it poses a huge barrier to training and skills development. And then there is absence of tangible progression routes and financial rewards for those who wish to continue to work in this sector. There are not enough returns, there is a lot of investment of time and energy, and then they don't gain back enough. And then they migrate and they go to work in different sectors, they seek jobs, and they just get reduced to part-time artisans, which is not a good sign. And then we also saw some case studies from Gujarat, Rajasthan, especially Jaipur and Orissa. So this one was from Gujarat, and it was talking about different forms of handicraft activities. And what we saw alarming was again what I was mentioning just now. The number of artisans which are part-time is so huge, it's more than half of the total number. And that they are not practicing these craft forms as their sustainable livelihood. They have to rely on different supplementary income and different other activities. And then we also talked about the reasons, why a particular artisan or a craft person or an individual joins the handicraft sector. And then we saw here an alarming number that, there were only 5% of the total respondents who came to this sector because of the government help or who were aware that the government help existed. Then we also saw the weaknesses of the handicraft artisans, and we tried to understand these issues and challenges and the problems that are faced. So again, the lack of managerial skills, there was lack of education, scarcity of capital, less knowledge about market and marketing, and then lack of information about the government aid and lack of organized identity. They sometimes have conflicts within themselves, and there's competition among the craft persons because of which the quality standards and pricing vary. So all those issues, and then they sometimes have no information about the exports. So we tried to understand through these case studies and already existing researches what are the key challenges and issues and how could they be addressed through policy formulation. Further, we saw the challenges faced by the handicraft artisans, and we saw lot of these challenges over here. Again, here the lack of infrastructural facilities that we see, and then the changing taste and interest of people, changing market demand, and then the competition with the latest machine. So we discussed all this in detail, and we could just have a sort of a comprehensive understanding of these problems and challenges and issues that the craft sector is facing today. Then we saw this case study from Orissa, where it has been talked about, the challenges especially the women artisans face, and we see the lack of skill and design development training, lack of financial assistance, non-availability of raw materials, and increasing cost of raw materials, all the issues that we have been seeing so far. So we see a lot of commonality, and we see a lot of common issues and challenges, be whatever be the state or the region, but more or less there are a lot of common issues and challenges, and I'm sure there could be a sort of a system that could be made to take care of these common issues, and then there could also be horizontal and vertical linkages to take care of them across different communities, taking care of the regional variations, and also sort of developing a network amongst the states. And we just also saw the problems associated with the marketing of the products and how the middleman comes into picture, and then there are a lot of cases of exploitation and other things. So we saw all these issues and challenges, and there were also problems in procurement of raw materials that we came across, and high price is one thing. Lack of testing facilities is another reason why this has been faced. Sometimes the poor quality raw material is available, and because of which the product which is made is also not good. And the difficulty in marketing the products, so a lot of data related to that, growing competition, low returns, again scarcity of raw materials, and there is a lot of competition from the machine made products. Then we discussed about the bottlenecks to market the products, and again we saw a lot of issues that have been highlighted by a lot of organizations, individuals, and researches like this that we are taking reference to. Unorganized market and dispersal of products because of the informality of the sector that we have been discussing about. That's again a challenge, how to market the products. Lack of working capital, there is lack of market intelligence, and lack of government support as per the respondents survey. But of course sometimes, most of the times, government support, even if it is there, it somehow doesn't reach to them. So that's again an issue. There were also suggestions to improve this sector that we discussed about, and we saw all these kinds of case studies. So after discussing the issues and challenges, we also talked about the policies and reforms in the craft sector, and we discussed how the current government is very keen towards this model of establishing creative and cultural industries and seeing craft industry as a labor intensive job creator. The findings of the Craft Economic Impact Study done by the Crafts Council of India, it emphasizes on the importance of crafts to achieve social and political stability. So we also saw the findings of the Craft Economics and Impact Study. And it also suggested the increasing number of women participation and how it is very beneficial, and it contributes in the economy and the entire production cycle. We discussed about that, and also the current government is very focused on creating opportunities for entrepreneurship, for training, for capacity building, and a lot of policies are getting aligned to these focus points, and that's how the schemes are coming up and the policy frameworks are getting developed. We also discussed the national design policy and what are the important highlights that it has put forth. And one of the important things it emphasizes on is the creation of platform for creative design development, design promotion and partnerships. So how to create the convergence, how to create a platform that brings in people from different backgrounds and knowledge together, and then come up with sort of a production system and designs which have value addition and which also benefit the craft person as well as the designers involved. And it will generate, according to this policy, the better employment opportunities and also improve the standards of living of the craft persons, which again should be a core concern while making policies, because it's not just the increase in the numbers or the projections, the growth rates that we have to see. Eventually it has to give satisfaction to the community, to the craft person, and there should be an enhancement and improvement in the quality of standards of living by these craft persons. Further, the policy also highlighted the creation of original Indian designs and valuing what is original to India, what creates its identity, and how to do value addition in small steps and not just snatch away from the soul of the product which is made by the craft person. And then making India a major hub for exports and outsourcing of designs and creative processes. This is also highlighted in the policy and we discussed about it. Then enhancing the overall tangible and intangible quality parameters. Again, because we have been talking about creating awareness, a lot of artisans and craft persons do not know about schemes, policies, reforms. So creation of awareness among manufacturers and service providers, particularly SMEs and cottage industries, about the competitive advantage of original designs. So awareness about different schemes and policies, and particularly here awareness about the strengths of the original Indian designs which come through customization, which come through the very rigorous and involved process of making a product. Then sustaining and strengthening India's traditional knowledge, skills and capabilities while being sensitive to global heritage. So being sensitive to the global heritage and what is the need of the hour is of course very much crucial and required, but then also not giving away what traditionally has been practiced and what is the bridge between the two and how the tradition and continuity they work together. Then we also discussed how government is thinking to take up policies which discuss the importance of integrating art and craft skills in built forms, and that's where the building craft scenario come into picture. And we discussed how art, craft, interior architecture now come under the creative industries umbrella, and then how they could be really worked together to come up with policies to have an integration and linkages between these three. Then continuing with our discussion on policies and reforms, we also discussed about the 12th five-year plan and how the plan recognizes some priority sectors, specifically textiles and garments, leather and footwear, gems and jewelry, food processing industries, and of course handicrafts and handlooms, because it's again a very priority sector involving a lot of number of artisans and craft persons, and it generates a lot of employment. And we also talked about some sort of consensus now being achieved in the government policies and the different schemes that it takes, and there is an effort to solve this lack of convergence. So somewhere we have been successful, somewhere we have not been, but it's a welcome step that government is at least thinking about achieving this consensus. And of course we talked about the very important National Skill Development Mission, and we talked about what was the purpose for which it was created and the vision of skilled India, how important it is, and how now there is also the formulation of Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, which is the streamlined institutional mechanism through which the National Skill Development Mission works. We talked about its structure and how at different levels what is the focus and how there is an importance to policy and guidance, targets and review, and there is also assessment and monitoring when the policies get implemented. We also discussed about the 5 main pillars which the skill development mission focuses on, and it talks about connect, correct, create, catalyze and certification. We discussed about that, and it's a very welcome step while creating policies and reforms related to the craft sector in India. Other than that, we also enlisted few more policies. So we also discussed about the export promotion scheme for handicrafts, schemes for product development, then schemes of the Office of Development Commissioner, handicrafts, Ministry of Textiles. We further talked about the Baba Sahib Ambedkar Hastshilp Vikas Yojana. We talked about Bima Yojana for the handicrafts artisans, credit guarantee schemes that have come up, comprehensive handicrafts cluster development scheme, and so many other. Again, like it's not an exhaustive list. We also looked upon the model that China and a country like Vietnam follows, and what is their way of making policies when it is about the craft sector, and how they put a lot of emphasis on education in the craft sector and this education craft program which they call for the young population, then the another one training program for the unemployed population, and then there is this third one training program inside workplace aimed at the current craftspeople. And how as an international case the other countries are looking forward to this model of the 3-tier, and then they are trying to learn and apply the understanding in their own context. We saw the case of Vietnam, how it is the trade department in Vietnam that promotes the entrepreneurial interests of traditional artisans, while other departments simply ensure that raw materials, fuel and easily accessible marketing systems are provided without fuss and hassle. So the artisan or craft person is not running around to procure raw material, and he doesn't go through everyday hassle, and get exploited by the middlemen and lot of different people who are involved. But it is channelized institutionally, and there are different ways how it is being provided to the craft persons, and they can then concentrate on the production and creativity. We also saw certain gaps after discussing these policies and schemes, and we saw the case of rural and small scale industrialization, which has held a special place in the Indian development thinking and policy formulation, but again there are a lot of gaps, and then it does not derive from a universal consensus with regard to the rationale and policy framework applicable to this subsector. So it's an important sector, but there are a lot of gaps that the researchers and the organizations and the individuals they have analyzed, and there are problems with the policies related to RSSI which need to be really understood and overcome. We also talked about working age population of India and how it's a huge number which is in the unorganized sector. So how the policies really take care of this informal unorganized sector is the concern. And the craft sector employs about 11 million people, out of which 43 lakhs are in the handloom sector itself. To come up with policies for such a huge number and to really take care of the challenges and problems which are related to it, it's again a very humongous task. Maybe it needs a policy in place itself to make the policy for this sector. So we are talking about lives and livelihoods of this enormous number of people, and then the policies like the introduction of GST comes into picture, which somehow troubles all these artisans and craft persons, and then we try to understand how important it is to monitor and assess the policies which get made, because sometimes they are on paper for the betterment and empowerment of these artisans and craft persons, but the result is opposite of what is being envisioned. So that is again a gap. Then there are also gaps in the present quality standards of formal and informal training, and especially when we talk about women. So that gap needs to be addressed, and we also discussed the need of developing a skill mapping model which would reduce and bridge the gap between the existing level of training of skills and the desired level of training of skills. So this is again a gap, and if a model like this is developed, this could be bridged. And we also discussed how the poor implementation of policies is a major concern, and no matter how many policies get made, until and unless the implementation is done effectively, the result is not going to be achieved. So we talked about that, and then we also talked about recurring barriers related to policy, which we see at different stages, right from the initial stage of communication and development to the final stage of implementation and execution, also getting feedbacks and the monitoring process involved. We saw the problems related to the enterprising environment, also saw the problems related to the entrepreneurship development, and what are the different kinds of gaps that we come across while talking about policies related to both of these. We discussed that briefly. And we also talked about the power loom sector, which is an important sector of the craft industry in India, and Ministry of Textiles makes very sound policies for the power loom sector, but somehow again these policies are not reaching on ground, and the major gap from the formulation of the policy to the implementation is the lack of awareness of these about these policies, that these policies and schemes actually exist. The artisans and the craft persons are not aware about these. So the dissemination also needs to be addressed, and the policies should actually reach to the end beneficiary. That's how they will draw benefit out of it. We had this discussion on a major concern where we were talking about the health hazards faced by the artisans and craft persons, and how sometimes policies do not address the occupational health services and the hazards associated while weaving or while doing very minute and detailed work like zari work. So there are respiratory problems, there are vision related problems, and they have to be addressed. Because if the maker is not healthy, it would reflect on the productivity, and if the standard of life is not good, what's the point of making all these policies, and what's the point if you cannot give a healthy life to the community involved. And of course we discussed about the gap analysis several times, so I'm not going to discuss now. We discussed about the entire existence of gaps and problems and how they are tried to be solved. So that we discussed. And we also discussed about the workstations, we also discussed about the location, what is the strategic location where the workplaces or the workshops of the craft persons and artisans should be, whether within the city or outside, and how this shift is happening, where earlier historically the workstations or the workshops were situated within the city, and now they are pushed out of the city for several other reasons. And we discussed the physical design of tools and workstations alone is not going to solve the problem, but it is also important to understand, that the designer who is involved while working with the artisans and craft persons, that designer must understand the work and rest cycle of these craft persons, the processes involved and the physical exercise and training, so that the maximum result is received. We discussed about the poor working conditions and the absence of technical protection, and how these workstations and work conditions in which the artisans work, they really need to be upgraded, both in terms of infrastructure and also in terms of the experiential quality. And finally, we also discussed about some institutional responses vis-a-vis the policies and the concerns related to the craft sector. So we discussed some frameworks and the recommendations by DICRC and the model that they adopt themselves for working. So when we see here the role of policies, we discuss how DICRC follows these 4 important points here about upgrading the social position, inculcating heritage preservation, fostering economic sustenance, generation of innovation and development, and how within these 4 important nodes, what are the further activities that they do and how they try to achieve objectives of the policy in the craft sector. That is what we discussed. Right now I'll just briefly give an overview, and they talked about these factors and suggestions for consideration, which are like the 4-step important process involving the policy formation, awareness, implementation, and of course finally the assessment. And they also suggest the craft sustenance through collaborative efforts and linkages, where craft is at the center, and then there are different links, there are different collaborative efforts that happen, and that's how the craft could sustain. And giving a sort of a policy framework and talking about certain methods of work which give adequate infrastructure, which put people in focus, which are the craft persons and the communities, value their process that they employ while working. Also understand the value of the original designs and the products they make, and suggest value addition and incremental innovation that we talked about. So innovation is here. How through education there could be awareness about our traditional craft knowledge systems that we again discussed in few previous slides and also the previous lectures, and how to link the craft communities and clusters to the market, equip them with the knowledge about the marketing and managerial skills, and of course the value associated with the word craft itself. And craft knowledge, how it is transferred, preserved, disseminated and valued. And finally, we also talked about the lack of convergence amongst the different policies and schemes of government, and how the different individuals and organizations and departments of the government who are involved in this entire craft sector policy formulation and implementation of schemes, how they are working in different silos, and then there is a lack of convergence and there is a lack of ecosystem. We talked about it. So again, this is what I was talking about in the previous slide, the lack of convergence and lack of creation of ecosystem, and this is one major concern, and this is what sums up what we have been discussing in the previous 4-5 lectures. Our next module will focus on continuity and revival, research and documentation perspective. We touched a little bit on the continuity and the tradition part, the tradition and the continuity part. So we are going to see this in the next module. And let's see some references now. This is the consolidated list of all the references that we have gone through in the previous 4 or 5 lectures. Thank you.